Hello, friends. We are finally back of episode 221 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. We had, we'll just call life happen last week that put both of us out of our respective commissions a little bit. But we are back here this week to talk about the latest issue that's been released at ourweekly.org. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted that you joined us from wherever you are around the world. And joining me here is my awesome co-host, Mike Thomas. Always appreciate your flexibility, Mike, and accommodating my crazy schedule. How are you doing today?
No problem, Eric. This actually worked out well. I'm doing great. We're recording on a Thursday, I think, and Tuesday and Wednesday of this week were the RISC conference hosted by the ARC Consortium. So it was great to be able to fully focus on that conference. Sometimes things all just work out.
Yes, and we've heard great things about the RISC conference. We'll look for the videos to be posted on the YouTube channel shortly. But Mike, yeah, you did I'm sure an awesome job on your talk, and we can't wait to share that link out when it's out there.
Thank you.
All right, and speaking of great things to share, well, guess what? It's our weekly, right? They're all in the business of sharing, and we got a great issue. We have a couple of great highlights to talk about today. And our curator this week is Batul Almarzak. And as always, she had tremendous help from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and other great suggestions. Well, it's a bit of a recap from things that happened last year, but an effort that's very near and dear to my both enthusiast and professional heart, so to speak. It was a very busy year for a group that I'm a part of called the R Submissions Working Group under the R Consortium, which is a joint effort across industry partners and life sciences, as well as health authorities, to look at the use of open source to supercharge the process of clinical submissions. And we've had some great successes in years past because it's been at least 5 years, 6 years or so since this really began. And today we're going to talk about some of the two pilots that are nearing completion that had the bulk of their work in 2025, and then looking ahead to what we have in store for 2026, because we're not stopping anytime soon. So, recapping what happened last year, I personally was very involved with, along with the rest of our team, what we called Pilot 4, which took what we did way back a few years ago and helped successfully submit a Shiny application, what was built with the Golem framework, within the FDA's transfer protocol, and we were largely successful. That, of course, was using the traditional method of running a Shiny app, get your R code, and in this case an R package, download it, bootstrap the dependency libraries with renv, run the app locally on your system, and, execute it. Worked well, but can we make this easier for our reviewers? Because, it's a lot of work to take that bundle, get the package library set up. Can we just make that somehow encapsulated? Maybe containerize it. Yes, in fact, that is exactly what we did for the first half of Pilot 4. Was to leverage container technology to transfer that application. And this was quite the learning here. But the goal was to basically take that pilot application that we did a few years ago, create a custom Docker file that installs key system dependencies based on the Rocker image from the Rocker project, install renv, install the dependencies from the log file, and then run the application in that Docker image as the last step in the process, and have our health authority reviewers run that same container after they compile it in their system via Docker. And this had a few twists and turns along the way. We first thought we were going to do Podman for it, and then we were told, nope, we're going to do Docker with it. And it was a little bit challenging to get Docker set up on their infrastructure. There are some things that have happened on their side of the fence that I'm privy to say for a general statement, that the process of running containers at all is going to be a bit challenging due to infrastructure and other factors, and that it is robust for reproducibility, but there is definitely a learning curve involved with getting those dependencies installed and running a container. Technically speaking, we got it done after a couple iterations. And in fact, I made a learning guide that I can put in the show notes to help our reviewers in their review process understand not just what to do, but why we're doing it. And that was highly valuable. That was one of the nice outcomes of this. But we're probably a few steps away from making this mainstream in clinical submissions. But to date, this was the most technically successful submission involving a container, where you avoided a few of the pitfalls that happen in other projects. Now, what about another way of doing this? Mike, you know I'm a huge fan of WebAssembly ever since that all came in with WebR and, with the WebAssembly on the Python side before that. So we thought, why not convert that other application, that existing app, Shiny app, into a WebAssembly-powered app? Good news is that this was much easier for our reviewers to run as opposed to installing Docker and Windows Subsystem for Linux. They could take this bundle. There is one wrinkle to it, which I'll get to, but once they had the web server process and ready to go, they could compile this application in the WebAssembly process via Shiny Live and then run the application and verify that when they built it from scratch on their system, it worked just as advertised as it did back in Pilot 2. Great stuff there. The one wrinkle is that web server process. At this time, for technical reasons, you cannot just take a folder of these compiled WebAssembly files and just point your browser to it and be done. You do need some sort of web server process to run all this, and this is a known limitation of the current state of WebAssembly, at least on the R side of things. And we are spoiled by existing platforms such as GitHub Pages, Netlify, etc., where basically they're giving you that web server process free of charge. You just have to deploy your stuff to that service, and you can point people to that public link, and it will just work. That's when you see a lot of these great advancements in WebAssembly being shared in the R community. A lot of times they're on GitHub Pages or some hosting platform that takes care of that web server process. But for our health authority reviewers, they need to run everything locally. That's like almost non-negotiable. They're reviewing RO code locally. They're running these Shiny apps locally. They do not have a shared infrastructure of like deploying Shiny apps on a more robust service. Everything's done on the reviewer's machine. So with that, that meant that they had to launch a web server process via the HTTP UV-R package, which Shiny uses under the hood, to launch that web process. Certainly the overhead of getting that up and running is not nearly as complicated as just the traditional Shiny app, where you had to install the dependencies that the app required. In this case, you only needed the dependencies to run the web server process and Shiny Live. Once you have that, then WebAssembly takes care of getting the app dependencies via its own manifest. So I think we got some wins on that. But again, the biggest, kind of gotcha is that you still need something to run that web server process. Maybe we'll get to a stage when we don't need that anymore, but we'll find out. Either way, this blog post shares those wins and those additional constraints as far as what we learned. But that's not all we learned. We also learned about novel data formats. In the pharma space, there has traditionally been a format called XPT, which is basically a transport format that was originally created by SAS and then open sourced, that is in the current guidelines for submitting or for a sponsor to submit their clinical data. The data need to be in XPT format. XPT is a bit long in the tooth, my friends. Really, really long in the tooth. And it doesn't quite accommodate some of the novel structures that we're seeing these days, and even has some things about variable character limits for what a variable name can be that would make you scratch your head in 2026 and wonder, is there a better way? Potentially, yes. That's where the JSON format came into play. So Pilot 5 leverage, instead of using these XPT formats, let's leverage JSON via the dataset JSON R package, headed a joint effort of the Pharmaverse and Notorious Research. They bootstrapped this package in conjunction with cooperation from health authorities to help convert from this XPT format to this JSON format and feed that through the transfer protocol. There were some minor rework that had to happen that we had to do for the programming involved, but that was very minor, and it was, actually nothing to do with the JSON itself. But this was largely successful in terms of being able to import these data, run the programs that generate the statistical outputs of these data, and to get feature, or at least, one-to-one correspondence with what we submitted in traditional XPT files in past pilots. This is really promising. Is it going to be the cure for everything? Maybe not. But I think it's a huge step above XPT for sure. And between this and maybe future explorations of the Parquet format, I think we're going to be in good, footing to leverage some more novel, data formats in this submission process. Still work to be done, but there's a lot going on in this space. So I'm really encouraged by the findings of Pilot 5, and formal reports of this will be coming hopefully soon. Now, what about the future, my friends? What's going on there? One of the things that we've heard in various conferences is that, it's great you're submitting these data and R programs with this very limited open source data set that's now about 10 years old. It's about 5 or 6 data sets. They're not big, small sample size. That's the number of records. Not many outputs. It just doesn't really feel realistic in terms of what a sponsor will actually submit through this gateway, i.e. a late phase trial with thousands of patients, potentially hundreds of table figures and listings. That's the acronym we like to use, on top of, the data that's going into this. So there are 2 new pilots that address this somehow. And one of them is called Pilot 6, where we want to build new programming that do new results, but not always do it ourselves, so to speak. We want to look at a way to get a little help along the way. And yes, that does mean where we can leverage it, why not look at new technology to bring newer frameworks like AI and LLMs to help us bootstrap this programming in a constrained way. We're early. We have some promising findings thus far, but in the end, we hope that leads us to a lot more rigorous amount of programs that can be used to demonstrate that, this whole R and open source, you can build your whole program on that, not just like a handful of things. Finally, we get to the other effort on this, and that's about the data itself. The data, as I said, that we've been using for the previous pilots is about 10 years old, very small, not really realistic in the late phase setting. Why not figure out a way to really take this up a notch and generate synthetic data that mimics a late stage trial, has, very relatable characteristics, and can be used for realistic benchmarking of how R can perform with much larger data sets. That's what Pilot 7 is going to be tackling, where we look at, again, using novel technology to help build this synthetic data that is not just like toy data, right? This will be inspired by, hopefully, at least schematics of realistic clinical submissions, but really give the interested person that wants to use this data a fully open, available set of data that has not just the typical demographic, maybe high-level efficacy, but a whole boatload of data. And again, it will all make sense in terms of the formats, and then we can use that in future pilots to answer that question of, yeah, R worked on the small scale. What about really big data? I know it can work. I've seen obviously R work very well with large data sets, but it's about time that our industry has a tangible example to point people to say, yes, it's entirely possible. And here is a data set or a set of data that you can stress test this with, like we are doing in this submissions working group. So lots of other nice nuggets in the blog post. That's a long-winded recap of everything. And again, because I've been involved in a lot of this, I've been able to speak on this, but this has been a total team effort. Shout outs to obviously our members in the submissions working group like Ben Straub, Ning Wang, Yilong Zhang, and many others, but also our cooperation with the R Consortium to give us that foundation and platform to try out all these things and get everybody involved. So we got a ways to go, but been a productive year, I must say.
Yeah, this is fantastic, Eric. And I think sort of the concepts here about the breakthroughs and the hurdles that you're able to overcome in a highly regulated space like this identify with a lot of other folks. I think you'd be surprised. But it's very exciting to hear that, there's this move for regulatory submissions to the FDA away from, SaaS-based workflows, more towards R-based submissions. And I think there's some people asking out there, is SaaS dead? I'm just kidding. Nobody's asking that. I'm going to take the high road here. You don't have to answer that question. And I'm going to say that choice is good. So use whatever tool works best for you. How about that?
Book it. I love it.
All right. I saw a data influencer out there on LinkedIn recently. I'm going to call him out. Jepson Taylor, used to go by Ben Taylor. Who essentially said that there is proof that stupid people still exist in the world because there are people that use R when it sucks. So,
well, now
I don't like you, Jepson Ben Taylor. So hopefully he's listening and this gets back to him. I'm sure it won't, but it was really interesting to hear your journey through containers and moving towards WebAssembly for sort of the handoff process. We're thinking a lot about WebAssembly these days for Shiny apps, particularly around how it solves a lot of the security concerns that exist with hosting Shiny for others to maybe upload their own proprietary data to. And with WebAssembly, you don't have to worry about that because it's all on the client side. It's on their own computer, which is really, really important for folks like us, vendors who are working with clients who we need to use their proprietary data to within the tools that we build for them. But there's this whole sort of security step in the middle that can be a large pain point. And if WebAssembly is the modality for us to get around that hurdle, it can be really fantastic for us, and I'm sure a lot of others. I know there are still a few wrinkles with WebAssembly, and obviously performance with really large Shiny apps can be tricky, but definitely lots of promise here, and I'm sure more innovation coming. And also excited on that note to hear about you moving from to more modern formats like JSON and potentially Parquet, and away from that legacy XPT format. That sounded a little scary, but
we could do a whole nother episode of my Wars of XPT. We'll save the listeners some bandwidth there.
I certainly believe it. And this topic of synthetic data is one that I've been hearing everywhere lately in all sorts of industries. We are actually trying to evaluate the feasibility of generating synthetic accounting data through a combination of like some Python sampling, configuration files, and a large language model, and maybe give users like a front end application for them to be able to set a few different inputs and toggles and then click a button and generate, really large scale synthetic data instead of, the past where somebody had to kind of put that together by hand, or it was really difficult to do. I know that synthetic survey data is really changing that whole survey research space as well. There was a pretty interesting article from iamYannC recently on how they did this for Colgate, the toothpaste company.
Oh, interesting.
Really large scale survey for them. So maybe we can, I'll try to link that in the show notes for us. But overall, it seems like, you and the folks working on this, Eric, are really, maybe finally breaking down some legacy barriers to innovate in this space. So very exciting to hear that progress is still continuing here.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, and in fact, you could even, if you really want to go in the Wayback Machine, trace back to the first ever our pharma conference that many of us in this industry that were enthusiasts about open source and R finally just said, let's all talk to each other. Stop doing this in our company firewalls only. Let's get cross-network collaboration together. And I'm a firm believer that if not for that event, maybe the submissions working group doesn't exist as it does now. It really inspired all of us to get this going. And the other ethos that in this new age that we're looking at now of leveraging newer technology to accomplish some of these goals, it's not like these new pilots may actually be part of a submission on their own. They're meant to be the foundation for future things. But throughout the process, it is non-negotiable that everything we build here is completely transparent. If you are interested in this, we're not hard to find. We have a submissions working group site, and there is no compromise on our ideals, no matter what kind of technology we're looking at here. So trust me, I know it is a crowded, space, so to speak, in terms of, this reliance on this platform, like this frontier model or whatnot. What happens when, that company changes direction? We're going to make sure that everything we build here is, again, completely in the open and that there are no, gates in front of this. It's very hard to find realistic synthetic data that can meet the kind of things that we want to do in life sciences with these pilots or, frankly, other efforts, even benchmark statistical methods. Even if you want to get access to clinical data that's been open source, shared by a sponsor, there's often a very rigorous process to get approval to do that. And then once you get access to it, you obviously can't really share what you build on top of that. So this is different. With this fully synthetic set, we have the leeway to share wherever the heck we want to be built from this. And that is, again, going to hopefully be the feeder to future investigations. And yeah, we are a nimble group that loves to push the envelope. The things we learned in Pilot 4 alone were things that I will take with me for a very long time in my continued adventures in this industry. And certainly credit to our health authority reviewers too. I'm probably not allowed to say them by name, but you know who you are if you're listening to this. And really thank you all for your patience as you tried something new and really helped to make it very successful. So a lot to go around.
Love to see it.
All right, and for rounding out our highlights today, we admit that first highlight had a lot going on there, but we're happy to share that for this last highlight here, a very good friend of ours in the open source and R communities is back and blogging about his adventures. We are very excited to see a new blog post from the esteemed Yihwei Xia, author of Knitter, R Markdown, and almost anything in the downverse. He was a huge part of it. And he comes to us again with his blog that's been resurrected this year on a topic that, has a lot of interesting attempts at it, but he's got his own take on it. And that's dealing with nested lists. In R, I've always been, a proponent of the list structure as being that any structure you want, you can feed into a list. Could be a nested set of vectors, could be a list of data frames, could be a list with 5 levels deep. And that's where that nesting stuff often comes in play, even when you import JSON data that you might get from an API or whatnot. So, but the thing is that on the surface, when you have these more complicated nesting structures, it's a bit difficult in kind of the base R experience to get a good handle on viewing that. You might turn to the handy str or stir package, or function, depending on how you pronounce it, to give you that high level look at the different items in that list, but it doesn't really scale well to the nested list structure. So part of Yihwei's efforts in the last year or so have been yet another package in what I'll call the downverse, the light down package, as a very minimalist approach to creating markdown or I should say parsing markdown to HTML. And one of the things that he put in support for this, much like how in other, like R Markdown or whatnot, and even Chordal, you can have tabbed tables, like tabbed interfaces to navigate between different views of like HTML pages or whatnot. eWay has added support for nested tab sets. That's pretty neat right there. But he wondered, you know what? Actually, this can go back to helping with nested lists. So in eWay's package called XFun, which has been in my RM library for years, whenever I used any of eWay's stuff, he's got a new function there called tab set. So what it does out in the tin, it's what you might expect. You just simply call tab set, feed into it a list, and this list could be a lot of things. We'll get to that shortly. But it doesn't matter if that list is nested or not. It's going to give you a tab display in your viewer of whatever ID you're working with those different first elements at the top. And then if you have nested elements, they would be in a tab set below that initial tab set. The example in the blog post is looking at a data frame as part of this, i.e. the Penguins data set. And when you see in the blog post, it's got tab sets for each column in that data set, along with a column called ATTR, short for attributes, because you would actually see that if you did a str function on the data frame, you would often see the attributes at the end, which in this case is the row names and the class, which not very fancy for this, but that ATTR tab is showing you what happens when you have a nested list of something, because that ATTR list had two sub-elements, row names and class. So you can do this of a lot of different creative ways. He also, you could even pass in like customizations of certain outputs. He has some examples where you can augment, let's say, that Penguin summary with the full content of each element and not just like the structure itself with the dput function. You could also show what the actual printout of each element would be if you accompany that first argument with a function call like print. You can do that as well. Apparently, he's also saying that if you have a plot object with recorded plots in this blog post, you could easily do a tab set with that as well. So he admits he hasn't spent too much time developing this. It's more of a quick way to get this high-level nested list viewing, but maybe there are other possibilities to make this even more, nice for certain types of nested lists. Maybe we could have ways to view HTML content as part of these tab sets if that list has to do with HTML-like structures. Lots of possibilities here. So he actually has, ways that you could build your own function as that second argument to do some interesting things. So your imagination is the only limit here for what you might do with XFun tab sets. And, this is timely as well because depending on which IDE you're using, yes, RStudio does have a nice way of viewing nested lists in their IDE. You can just view that and you get that nice little caret thing to expand the different list elements. There actually isn't anything close to that, in my opinion, with Positron or VS Code. And so maybe XFun, the tab set, can be helpful in that interface. Hey, send us feedback if you think of an easier way to do this, but I like that this tab sets function could be used wherever you're using R, however you're using R, and get a little nicer glimpse into what that nested list looks like. So great to see eWay back on the blog sphere here, and I will be giving XFun tab set a try in my next nested list adventure.
Absolutely. It's great to see eWay back. Whenever I think about eWay, I always think about the R podcast and the episodes that you had eWay on. I think a couple. There was one in 2018, which was just a really awesome episode to really get to the heart of who eWay was at the time. I'm sure lots changed since then, and his contributions to open source and everything that entailed. But anyways, great to see him and blogging again. XFun, whenever I'm working with retrieving information from an API, which is usually coming back as a JSON object, nested list, things like that, I always seem to find that I need a particular function from XFun that just sort of saves my life in that process. So I'm very grateful for his work, on this type of like recursive list handling concepts that really just make our life easier. I could not imagine if we had to write loops to unnest all of this stuff all of the time if we didn't have that. And the blog post is a great way to see it in action. You can see that Penguins tab set that gets created with that nested tab set, as you mentioned, Eric, when you get to the ATTR or attributes section of the initial output. So really, really interesting, really powerful. When I think about, potentially including this in all of the Cordo work that we do, I think it could be really powerful, save us a lot of time, effort, and coding, to be honest, make things a lot more concise. And the fact that we can even customize the content that gets displayed in the output, it doesn't necessarily have to be what the default is. He mentions you can pass other functions like dput or print, or even write your own function to display, for example, numeric vectors as stem and leaf plots. It's pretty incredible. And talks a little bit about some of the future potential that it could even be, generalized to support richer content like interactive visualizations or tables or images within the tab. It's excellent. So I'm excited to take a look at actually the source code. He mentions that it's not much. It's pretty concise. So I'd be interested to take a dive into that and see sort of what the secret sauce is under the hood. But it's great to read an eWay blog.
It sure is. And I am also intrigued. And like I mentioned near the top of that intro there, his efforts with Lightdown. And there is, there's certain, parts of the community, and I can identify with this, especially putting my like Linux dev hat on. There are sometimes we just want a lightweight tool to do something quick, right? And Lightdown is really intriguing. If you want to just get to that HTML from Markdown and use what you learn with R Markdown without being in R Markdown itself, you can do it. And I'll put a link to the documentation for Lightdown in the show notes here. It's really intriguing, and I'll be honest, I would love to talk to him again on a future episode, because I feel like there's been a lot that's happened in what he's learned since that episode you mentioned, when we were, I'm going to say bluntly, blown away by what he shared there, and the fact that I think he's had even more learning since then, and his approach to tackling these tech issues and these desires to try new things, but again, in a way that we all can benefit. So Lightdown definitely has my attention to look at maybe for the future when I need a more minimalist approach to getting that next HTML report without maybe some of the overhead some of the other frameworks have. So definitely worth checking out, if nothing else, to see eWay's masterful approach to bootstrapping these new projects. It's always fun to see. And with that is going to wrap up our highlights section of the episode. But as always, our weekly has many more things to talk about if you want to look at the rest of the issue. We don't have time today, but we invite you to check out the issue. It's always linked in the show notes that you can find a direct link to this week's issue. Great, as usual, assortment of great blog posts, packages, new packages, updated ones, and the full gamut across the R community. And with that, we're going to tell you all about how you can get in touch with us, because the R Weekly effort is an open source effort. We rely on the community as both, our primary user base, but also to help us along the way. It's all an open model, just like what I mentioned with the submissions working group. Everything we do in the open in there, we do everything in the open of R Weekly. Just a pull request away to get that new resource that you found online. Maybe you built a great, package or wrote a great blog post. We want to hear it. Send us a pull request. It's all linked at rweekly.org to get a pull request to our upcoming draft. If you know GitHub, you know Markdown. eWay is the one that said, if you can't learn our Markdown itself in 5 minutes, he would give you $5. He didn't have to give anybody $5 at that conference. He said that quote in because everybody can learn it. And I think you can too. And also, you can get in touch with us in different ways. We have a contact page in the episode description in your favorite podcast player. You can also reach us on social medias. I am on Blue Sky with @our_podcast at bsky.social. I am on Mastodon with @our_podcast at podcastindex.social. Sometimes I have to keep them all straight. There's a lot going on there. And I'm also on LinkedIn. You can search my name and you'll find me there causing some mischief here and there. And Mike, where can the listeners find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky at mike-thomas.bsky.social or on LinkedIn if you search Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK. You can see what I'm up to.
Yep, and we'll be eagerly seeing for that announcement of the risk conference presentations, because we'll be eager to watch that again on demand with what you talked about and what others have shared in that space. With that, we're going to close up shop here for episode 221. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for being patient with us. And we hopefully will be back with a new edition of our Weekly Highlights next week.